COP27. Most sane people are going out for dinner, but here we are enjoying a session about from the IPCC, from Working Group 2. So the session tonight is Healthy Planet, Healthy People. What does adaptation mean for ecosystems, and why does it matter to people? So if you think about where we are and the backdrop, we've got an ongoing energy crisis, ongoing food insecurity, a global pandemic that's still not over. We have record temperatures, increasingly frequent heat waves, wildfires, droughts, floods. We have 1 million species at risk of extinction from climate change. And never before, I think, has it been clear that our relationship with the natural world is broken and placing human health and livelihoods at risk. So this session tonight, I'm really excited to be here tonight. And so the IPCC Working Group 2, which is the one on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, will present some of their findings. So we've got 5 authors here, or we'll get 5 authors from 5 chapters. So out of 18 chapters of the assessment report, that's a pretty good going. So over 25% of the chapters are covered here. And I'll go through from my left, your right. So first of all, we'll have Mike Moorcroft, who is coordinating lead author of Chapter 2, and that's on terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems. So Mike is actually the only of the panel that I've met before tonight. He's an ecologist at the UK Government Conservation Agency, Natural England, and he leads on science of climate change, adaptation and mitigation there. And he'll be presenting on adaptation options for terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems. Next we have Sarah Cooley, who is coordinating lead author of Chapter 3, which is on marine and coastal ecosystems, and Sarah is the Director of Climate Science at the Ocean Conservancy in Washington, D.C. And she'll be speaking on adaptation options for marine and coastal ecosystems. Rachel Besner-Kerr is next in the middle, and she's the coordinating author of Chapter 5, which is on food. And Rachel is the professor in global development at Cornell University, and she does research on Africa, on sustainable agriculture, gender, climate change adaptation and food security. And she'll be talking about adaptation in forests and agricultural systems. Catherine Bowen is lead author of Chapter 7, which is on health, and our second professor here tonight. So she's a professor of environment, climate and global health at the University of Melbourne. And she'll be talking about joining up between adaptation, nature and human health. And finally, Chris Trios is the coordinating lead author of Chapter 9, which is on Africa, and he directs the Climate Risk Lab for the African Climate and Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town. And he'll be talking about adaptation in African ecosystems. So each of our speakers has 5 minutes. They'll each have a presentation, and I'll be sort of firm but not too strict on the timing. And then I hope we can have a great interactive discussion with the audience here. So Mike, over to you.
Thank you very much. So hopefully we've got some slides coming up. So yes, I'm going to talk about terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems. But I want to start with the really big scale perspective on this. And one of our key findings in the report as a whole was this one, that maintaining the resilience of biodiversity and ecosystem services at a global scale depends on effective and equitable conservation of approximately 30 to 50% of Earth's land, freshwater and ocean areas, including currently near natural ecosystems. Now, that's quite a dense statement in true IPCC style, but each of those words has been very, very carefully thought about, and we do have high confidence in it, as you'll see. And a number of different lines of evidence and different analyses in the scientific literature lead us to conclude this. And the thing is that climate change interacts with all the other pressures that we put the planet under, that our biodiversity and our ecosystems are facing, things like degradation and fragmentation of land and pollution and the rest of them. And the fact is that very small fragmented areas of natural habitats find it very difficult, do not support healthy populations of species or the systems, the services that they provide. And climate change makes those risks, the vulnerability of those species and services that much higher. It's what we call a risk multiplier sometimes. So 30 to 50% is the sort of level at which you can get the large-scale protection that will allow the protection of, for example, carbon sinks and stores, but also healthy populations and things like freshwater supplies as well. Now, there are a couple of important words in there, effective and equitable. And effective, it's got to work. It can't just be a protected area on paper, but not on the ground. Equitable, it does mean the needs of people and different countries need to be taken into account. So, for example, indigenous communities sustainably using an ecosystem for generations or millennia even. We're not seeking to say that those systems are degraded by that. That's sustainable. So that's the big picture, and it's obviously one that joins up between the UNFCCC and our COP here, and also the Convention on Biological Diversity and COP15 that's coming up. And the decisions there will also be really critical for this. So we understand what's happening at a global scale and the way that our biodiversity and ecosystems are under pressure from climate change. We can do quite a lot, though, to ameliorate the pressures on ecosystems from climate change by better management and stewardship and protection and restoration locally. And our chapter 2, came up with a number of different actions that were for which there was very good evidence that you could reduce the vulnerability of sites to climate change, protected areas, for example. And that includes, of course, large protected areas for the reasons I've explained, maintaining natural processes, but there's also things around maintaining the hydrology, increasing connectivity between habitat patches to allow species to move. There's quite a lot of elements there, which I won't go through in detail. I will just point out one at the bottom on the left-hand side of intensive management for specific species, which is one that is quite a difficult one, but in some cases will work. I'm not going to say much about this one, but it is also important to say that by managing the natural environment better, we can help people to adapt to climate change, both through green space in cities, the one example here, but also, for example, in natural flood management. So we can have win-wins for both people and nature, and my colleagues further on down the line will be touching on that a little bit more. So I'm going to pass on, and just really to say that actually we also have to face up to the fact that there are limits to which we can adapt and build resilience. Change is already happening. If you look at the map that you can see on the slide there, every one of the little symbols you can see, the kind of, you can only probably see dots, but triangles or squares and so on, represents a place on the ground where a biome scale change has happened. For example, forests moving into tundra or forests moving into grassland or so on. These are changes that are happening now, and conservationists will have to factor that inevitable change into their planning, because that's a factor of habitats, of ecosystems, and also of species distributions, for example. I'll stop there and hand you on to Into the Sea.
Thank you, Mike. May I have the clicker, please? Thanks. Yeah, you'll hear a lot of common themes. I was the CLA for the Ocean and Coastal Systems chapter. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you, Steve, for moderating us. First, I wanted to share what we did in Chapter 3. It focuses on ocean and coastal ecosystem services, and we looked at both impacts from climate to these systems and also the adaptation opportunities that are relevant for these systems. So this is a schematic of what we covered in our chapter. We looked at how climate is changing the properties of marine systems, shown along the top of the chapter map, and the mechanisms that interconnect marine and human systems. And so those mechanisms are really flagged on the bottom of this figure. So properties include things like temperature, acidity, the occurrence and severity of marine heat waves, and so on. The mechanisms that are changing include things like ocean circulation, biological productivity, evolution, and the abundance or quality or reliability of the services that marine ecosystems provide that sustain life on Earth. We also looked at the ways in which people manage the system and how they're responding to changes. We looked at the feasibility and effectiveness of adaptations. Feasibility is indicated in the blue circles, and that includes several different dimensions. Effectiveness is in the yellow circles, was evaluated by examining outcomes from models and observations. We also assessed the ability of different adaptations to address specific marine sectors at risk. That's on the right side with the check marks. What you should take away from this complex table is that there are many ocean-based adaptations. Look at the small print in the gray column. A lot of these adaptations address multiple sectors at risk. There you can see that by looking at the check marks on the right. See how many check marks are in each row. These adaptations are generally highly effective. Those are the big yellow circles. And they're often also highly feasible, which are the large dark blue circles. And I want you also to notice that the adaptations are clusterable into three major categories of socio-institutional adaptation, built infrastructure and technology, and marine and coastal nature-based solutions. If you can read the fine print, I'm sure you can see that adaptations that you've heard a lot about, like area-based protections or sustainable harvests, and you might also be seeing others you haven't heard as much about, like assisted evolution or institutional transboundary agreements. In all, we assessed that there was a solution set relevant for coastal and ocean ecosystems that has two big parts. The first part is that the impacts happening now and projected for the future show that rapid and ambitious mitigation is an opportunity to sustain marine properties and mechanisms in states that support the ecosystem structure and function that humans and other life on Earth have grown to depend on. Keeping future conditions near 1.5 degrees of warming will help avoid social and ecological tipping points. For example, this limit will help avoid widespread loss of warm water corals, the fisheries and ecosystems that depend on them, and the coastal protection that they offer. The second part of the solution set is that avoiding high emission pathways will help preserve the greatest number of ocean-based adaptation options. Ocean-based adaptation depends on relationships among species and the physical world and among the members of each ecosystem, including humans. Breaking any of those links via the effects of high emissions pathways will close off many adaptation options that depend on nature or traditional methods of resource management. Our assessment indicates that effective ocean-based adaptation relies on portfolios of measures that involve institutions, technology, and nature. And there's no single subset of the adaptation portfolio that could offer comprehensive adaptation alone. For example, we can't just invent the world into robust ocean-based adaptation. We've already seen instances of how excessive dependence on seawalls, for example, to address sea level rise prevents coastal ecosystems from moving upland, and that sometimes creates erosion problems elsewhere. Our assessment also indicates the ways in which adaptation is implemented matters. When talking about the sea level rise adaptation, for the summary for policymakers states with high confidence, these responses are more effective if combined and or sequenced, planned well ahead, aligned with sociocultural values and development priorities, and underpinned by inclusive community engagement processes. This statement is also true for the entire range of ocean-based adaptations implemented so far. Thank you.
Thanks, Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to the organizers. Thanks, Stephen. Very happy to be here this Saturday evening. What a great way to spend Saturday night, because we all care about ecosystems. We all depend on them. I'm going to walk through some of the key findings on adaptation options in food, fiber, and other managed ecosystem products, which is an exciting title. And we've heard about forests already. Our chapter looked at managed forests, sort of forestry, that is forestry where we are drawing resources from it. So I won't talk about the conservation, protection, and restoration of natural forests, which Mike spoke about already. We also did a feasibility and effectiveness assessment similar to the oceans chapter. Many of the chapters did, where we looked at different measures of feasibility and different measures of effectiveness. We looked at social, economic, environmental, and institutional feasibility, and we looked at whether it reduced climate risk, but also whether it had other benefits. And so the options that I'm highlighting today come from that feasibility and effectiveness assessment from the scientific literature. So we have a number of things that we can do in managed forests, including sustainable forest management, importantly diversifying and adjusting tree species composition. So diversification of forests is an important adaptation strategy, and managing increased risks from pests, diseases, and wildfires. Another important finding that touches on some of what Sarah was talking about already, and Mike, is cooperation and inclusive decision-making is really key in forest management with local communities and with Indigenous peoples. And because Indigenous peoples already manage and live in forest areas and play a key role in forest protection, conservation, and restoration, the IPCC Summary for Policymakers highlights recognition of inherent rights of Indigenous peoples as integral to successful forest adaptation in many areas. So this is we think an important finding, and it's a key theme throughout the report actually is attention to Indigenous peoples and their knowledge and recognition of that knowledge and their rights that are affected by management decisions. So now I'm going to turn to food systems, which is, I have to say, it's probably the mainstay of the chapter. And again, touching on some of what Mike and Sarah were talking about, we know, and the scientific literature is increasingly emphasizing the connection between ecosystems, biodiversity, and climate risk, and the interdependence of supporting ecosystems and biodiversity in order to reduce climate risk. And so in our assessment, for food systems, we found a number of different ecosystem-based adaptation approaches which not only reduce climate risks, but provide many other benefits for humans, such as food security, nutrition, strengthening livelihoods, and supporting ecosystem services and biodiversity. So we have a longer list in the chapter of the different options that can be used in food systems. These include things like agroforestry, ecosystem-based management of fisheries, and agroecology. And agroecology is an ecological approach to food production, which also is holistic and takes into account social and economic dimensions of the food system. But it works with natural processes. And so these are some exciting opportunities that we have to draw on based on drawing on the scientific literature for strengthening our food systems and reducing climate risk. I want to highlight one example, my hand-eye coordination here, of an agroecological practice and an ecosystem-based adaptation approach, which is agroecosystem diversification. That's a mouthful. Basically, more crops and plants and animals within a food system. So having crop rotation, having agroforestry, mixing crops and livestock, or crops, livestock, and trees. These are all agro-ecosystem diversification. And it sounds simple. Does that really reduce climate risk? But it can do things like it can buffer against heat stress. It can increase pollination. It can support yield stability and reduce the risk of crop loss from things like pests and diseases. So one study, for example, in Canada compared diversified rotations to just corn monocultures and found positive yield impacts, yield stability, and increased soil organic carbon under 2 different climate scenarios by 2100. So these are not just systems that are applicable in the global south, but they are applicable in multiple regions around the world. There are a number of barriers that prevent the implementation of these ecosystem-based adaptation approaches, including agro-ecosystem diversification. So there's a robust literature showing the benefits of this adaptation strategy in food systems, but there are many barriers currently that prevent people from implementing them, including subsidies, which tend to push towards one crop in a large scale, limited research and investment in this strategy, and low access to the infrastructure and markets that you would need to implement them. And I see Steve waving at me from the corner of my eye. So just to end on noting that in all of these adaptation strategies, the planning and implementation needs to consider the outcomes for different groups. So an inclusive strategy that really takes into account inequities in society is essential for avoiding maladaptation. In other words, for avoiding negative impacts on particular groups, particularly marginalized groups in society. So this is a finding for our chapter, but it's a finding for the report as a whole.
Thank you, Rachel. It certainly is. So my thanks to everyone for sticking with us Saturday night, as everyone is reminding us, but at least it's dark outside, so we're not missing the sunshine. Again, thank you, Steve, for moderating and the opportunity to speak. So what I'll be speaking about is really reflecting on Chapter 7, which is titled Human Health, Wellbeing and the Changing Structure of Communities. And really, for this 6th assessment report, we were able to, for the first time, look at a lot more research that's focusing on green spaces in particular, which is what I'll be talking about mainly in this short presentation. So there's been a lot more research now conducted in terms of the positive impacts on human health and well-being from the nature that surrounds us. And so that might come as a surprise to many of you, but it actually hasn't been a specific field of rigorous study for a very long time. So I thought I'd first start, though, with a bit of context. And you may or may not be aware that in 2019, the UNEP and the UN Human Rights Office prioritised efforts to promote and protect environmental and human rights with the signing of a new cooperation agreement in 2019. So the heads of these 2 UN bodies agreed that although more than 150 countries have recognised the human right to a healthy environment, significantly more work is needed to inform policymakers, justice institutions and the public on the various ways they can take action to uphold this right. So the aim of this is to better protect particularly environmental human rights defenders and their families who frequently face violence. But importantly to note that health stakeholder efforts to strengthen NAPs, NDCs, vulnerability and adaptation assessments and HNAPs, which are the Health National Adaptation Planning processes, support the fulfilment of this newly adopted UN human right on a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. So in Resolution 76 of 300, the UN General Assembly notes that the realisation of this right requires full implementation of multilateral environmental agreements. So that includes the Paris Agreement. So this actually has important implications for the way that we look at our environment and the way that we look at our humans' connection and the importance of health and the protection of our environment. So this is from chapter 7. Some of you may have seen a Sankey diagram before, but really what it shows is you can see the climate hazard on the left, the adaptation responses in the middle, and then the health outcomes on the right. And this was taken, this is in chapter 7. The reference is Schielbeck, who led a large number of authors who looked at individual studies, looking at different types of adaptation responses. And as you can see, the red one I've circled there is green infrastructure. So green infrastructure can have positive health outcomes in relation to, for example, mental health. The research is now showing us that spending time in nature can reduce a range of different mental health outcomes, including depression and anxiety. Also, we know that for patients in healthcare settings, so hospitals, for example, it's been shown that even viewing trees and green spaces from the window decreases the recovery time. So it's really important research that we're able to assess in this 6th assessment report. We also know that green spaces are correlated with higher amounts of physical activity. Hence the link down the bottom there, you can just see down the bottom the link to non-communicable diseases such as cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So I think the emphasis around the benefits of access for us to our natural environment, trying to start to now quantify that is really, really important in terms of the health and wellbeing literature. But we do need to bear in mind that not all green spaces are created equal. So we must account for issues around access, cultural differences, as Rachel was referring to, these issues of equity that help determine whether an individual or a community can actually make the most of the green space that might surround them. So we'd call these mediating factors that really determine individual and community use of green space. And also, we're also, as you see on the slide here, we're starting to learn a bit more about this concept of solastalgia too, and the change in your natural environment and how the degradation of the land in your natural environment can lead to a real feeling of loss. And so that's an important concept we're learning more around as well. So just briefly to also talk about another figure from chapter 7. This figure also shows the key adaptation responses that are relevant to green spaces. As I said, it's one example of our natural environment, but it's the example that in the health and wellbeing community we have the most literature on. So we can see in the 4th column, green infrastructure is highlighted as an activity most likely conducted at a local scale with local governments, but also this is being seen more and more by important by NGOs, for example. And at a lower scale, we can also see that at an individual level, there's more work going on in understanding nature-based therapy as a key adaptation response to climate impacts as well. And some of you might be aware of this nature-based therapy that's particularly common in countries like Korea and Japan. So that's an important area we're starting to learn more about too. And broadly, the research does show that green space can improve social cohesion and mental health, as well as I mentioned, a variety of physical benefits, also in relation to heat. And I think that this has already been spoken to a little bit, and reducing the urban heat island effect and the positive impact this has then on our ability to cope with heat and heat wave events. But important, as you can see on the slide, is again the issue of equity. So we know that exposure to heat stress and other issues is disproportionately experienced by those on lower incomes. So I think I'm being given the wrap up as well, but I wanted to finish on this last slide that this is, this is a report that was released by the WHO, and it's talking about the WHO's manifesto to ensure a healthy and green recovery from COVID-19. So I won't go through this for time, but please have a look at this important piece that's come out from the WHO that really talks about protecting and preserving nature as the source of human health. That's the headline statement, so I'd encourage you to have a look at that. Thank you. I'll pass to Chris.
Thanks, Catherine. So, hi everyone, I'm Chris Trisos, coordinating lead author of the Africa chapter, and I'll be talking about adaptation in African systems, ecosystems. And so, in African countries, there's a lot of evidence that governments recognize the importance of ecosystem-based adaptation. So looking through the nationally determined contributions, which is the contributions under the UNFCCC process for adaptation and mitigation actions in countries, about a third, just over a third actually, of actions listed by African countries can be classified as ecosystem-based adaptation. Most of these are in the water, the agriculture, forestry, and environment sectors. But this is an indication, a lot of this is conditional though on external financing, but it's an indication of a strong demand for ecosystem-based adaptation by African countries. A lot of ecosystem-based adaptation in Africa has a lot of potential. Some of these are in reduced flood risk from protecting and restoring forests and wetlands and riparian habitats. There's also storm surge protection and protection from sea level rise, as well as food security improvements from restoring and protecting coastal ecosystems such as mangrove and seagrass ecosystems. And then protected areas can act as stepping stones for species on the move. So as species change their geographic distributions due to climate changes, connecting protected areas is something that can allow species to migrate through landscapes. However, in some African contexts, this is currently a challenge because of fencing, and also a lot of proposed linear infrastructure, such as roads and pipelines, that are on the infrastructure development plans for African countries could bisect many protected areas or reduce the connectivity of the existing protected area network in Africa. Some of that infrastructure is essential, and so there needs to be a much smarter way of planning that infrastructure so that it doesn't reduce protected area connectivity, while at the same time allowing people to access local services, for example. There are large opportunities for ecosystem-based adaptation in African cities, which is an area where up to now this has perhaps been a less utilized approach, such as potential for restoring riparian habitats to reduce flooding in informal settlements. And then finally, there are limits to adaptation at higher global warming levels. So I think we hear a lot about ecosystem-based adaptation in Africa, but at the same time, if we're planning on relying on things like coral reefs as storm surge protection, then it's really important to limit global warming around 1.5 degrees Celsius. Otherwise, some of those natural-based protections can fail. There's also the risk of maladaptation and malmitigation. And so going around the COP this week, there's a lot of talk about forest restoration, about tree planting, but when that becomes afforestation of naturally unforested systems, such as grasslands or savannas or peatlands, we can have actual increases in risks for water security, food security, and biodiversity. So on this map, you're seeing naturally grassy biomes of Africa, grasslands and savannas, and mapped in purple there is targets of potential tree planting, such as through the AFR 100 campaign. And so this shows that planting trees in areas where they do not naturally occur, instead of being a climate solution, can actually expose those to increased carbon releases from those ecosystems under conditions of future drought and wildfire, as well as increasing food security and water security risks to local communities. When we restore these forests, and forest conservation and restoration is absolutely a good thing for climate, it's important to think about native reforestation as opposed to plantation forestry. So restoring a forest to something that is a diverse state is often a much more resilient condition, particularly under future climate threats, than large monocultures, often of exotic plantations, sometimes vegetatively propagated so that all the individuals in that plantation would be genetically identical and could be easily destroyed by something like a pest outbreak. And as a final thought, it's to say that there's large potential for ecosystem-based adaptation in Africa. but it's important that this involves local communities and includes indigenous knowledge systems. Indigenous knowledge systems in Africa have millennia of information and rich detail on local ecosystems and the services they provide to people, and it's crucial that those are included in adaptation projects. And in many cases in the Africa chapter, we find evidence that when that is done, the adaptation is more effective, both for people and the ecosystems they depend on. And I just finished by pointing out the chapter scientist for the Africa chapter, Luxon Svobjo, who is an expert on indigenous knowledge, is at the back of the room. But Luxon also has little postcards he can hand out that have a QR code you can scan, where you can get a sort of non-technical summary of ecosystem-based adaptation and other types of adaptations through different African subregions. Thanks.
Thanks, all. That was pretty good on the timekeeping. I was thinking for a minute it was going to be the further you got away from me, the longer you had. But it ends up being the professors talk longer than everyone. It wasn't distance from me, but that was really good. Thank you. So we've covered what we've covered basically the world here. We've got terrestrial and freshwater. We've got oceans. We've got food, agriculture, forests. We've got health, and then we've got a focus on Africa. So there must be some questions around, I guess, based on some of the things that we've heard. So I'd like to open the floor and see if we can have a discussion. Okay, I see gentleman here. So maybe we'll take a couple of questions and
Thank you very much. I have a question. So there is the announcement in this COP about the Saudi Green Initiative and the Middle East Green Initiative. The Saudi Green Initiative and the Middle East Green Initiative. I'm not sure if I said the name in the proper official name. So they announced that they will plant 10 billion trees and 50 billion trees. And I think this is obviously, seems that there is a political will to do some mitigation or define it as adaptation, I'm not sure. But the devil is always in the details, and there is a change in the ecosystem. So what is the role of the IPCC? And maybe I'm not sure how to frame the question. But this is going to be a big change, and what can we do to make sure that this big change, if it gets implemented, is done in the proper way? Thank you.
Okay, let me take another question. So we've got one question on tree planting in Saudi Arabia. So and the rest of the Middle East. Okay, and then let's take another question.
Thank you. My name is Denis Jansonwa. I work for C4. And then I am one of the lead chapter of a special report on land. But I was just curious to ask Christopher, when you were, working on the chapter in Africa, do you find some, I will say some potential or barrier related to the way ecosystem-based adaptation can be financed in Africa? What are some of the potentiality, and then what are the barriers that you identify in your study? And then I have a general question, on the ecosystem-based adaptation, because during the presentation, there was a sharing about the barrier and the strategy, and then I was asking myself if during the study you identify some enabling factor that exist already that could really help to push, I will say, ecosystem-based adaptation in general. Thank you.
Okay, let's have a go at those two. So I think maybe Chris and Catherine, you want to have a go at the first one? Okay, as you, the mic's near here. Let's have a go at the first one.
Yeah. So I should say I don't think anyone on the panel is an expert in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia specifically. So it's a more general point, because in chapter 2 we have particularly addressed this issue of where there are adverse consequences of tree planting in unsuitable places, usually done for mitigation reasons, occasionally for adaptation. from the way you phrased your question, I think you know the answer, that, we're done well and it's restoring natural forests that have been lost. Reforestation is a really good and really important thing to do. But Chris has given a specific example from Africa where there's a problem where savannas and other grassy systems have been identified as, if you like, degraded forest, which they're not. They're either treeless or sparsely treed systems, and they're a really unfortunate place to plant trees because of all the adverse impacts. And it will be exactly the same thing, I'm sure, particularly given this region has a lot of very arid and semi-arid zones. It will need very, very careful selection of places to actually plant those trees, good use of local knowledge, and even setting aside the human rights angle about it, just to actually make trees grow, you need local knowledge and expertise. And often, in the early stages, aftercare as well, it's much easier if you can get the forest to naturally regrow where it was with natural processes. So the principle is good, but the implementation is a really key issue, and it will need to be done very well.
I just want to add to what Mike said, because in our overall assessment for the report, the way forward for climate resilient development is not setting aside the human rights question, but equity and justice are essential for having climate resilient development. So in our chapter, we have a section looking at the literature, the evidence of afforestation projects that have negative impacts on people, particularly local and indigenous communities. And there is a long list of studies that have documented negative impacts. And so taking into account people's use of the land and their views on the use of the land is really crucial, as well as drawing on their knowledge for the ecosystems, but really understanding how that land is used. So there needs to be a lot of caution around making sure it's done well when there's afforestation projects.
On the Africa question, I think thank you for asking that. So ecosystem-based adaptation and adaptation more generally in the Africa chapter, we did quite a lot of looking into financing mechanisms. And most often where they have been financed successfully, it's through grant finance as opposed to loan finance. The current picture is that the majority of financing, tracked climate financing for climate action in Africa, is coming in the form of loans and not grants. For least developed countries, it's especially important to increase the amount of grant funding because adaptation costs are a higher proportion of their national income than for wealthier developed countries, so it's difficult for them to self-finance. For a lot of ecosystem-based adaptations or adaptation more generally that benefits marginalized and vulnerable communities, often these types of adaptations return quite public goods or diffuse benefits. The benefits typically outweigh the costs, but it so far seems to have proved difficult to attract private sector financing into those areas because unlike mitigation, where you can say invest in a renewable energy plant and get a direct revenue stream in payments per kilowatt hour generated, for adaptation, those finance models for the private sector have not developed and matured yet. And so I think there is a real need in the interim for the public sector, particularly through funding mechanisms like the 100 billion pledge and the new quantified global goal on climate finance, to really step up and recognize the importance of grant financing from public sectors for least developed countries around things such as ecosystem-based adaptation. One last final thought on tree planting pledges is I think we often hear numbers like 50 billion trees or 100 billion trees. And this is not IPCC, but in my personal experience, that sort of often evokes in your mind like 50 billion trees, but we're planting 50 billion seedlings, and that's very different from actually having 50 billion trees. And so I think we have to be a lot more skeptical about how much of these things might be greenwashing. Like, A, are they being planted, as colleagues have said, in appropriate places, respecting local human rights and indigenous knowledge, and ensuring that that can actually turn into a diverse, mature forest is very different from the number of seedlings that get planted. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Chris. Thanks for the first round of questions. So we've got a gentleman at the back there.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Actually, my question is regarding agroforestry as also a way to replanting. If, in your opinion, agroforestry can be like a considerable solution in order also to resolve the competition that sometimes there is on the soil between reforestation and agriculture. And I'm talking about successional agroforestries or that type of agriculture that try to rebuild the forestry succession, the forestry composition, but with also food elements. I'd just kindly ask an opinion on that. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman in the middle.
So my question is, the session started with the importance of these large-scale natural ecosystems, and then later also mentioned agroecology. And so I wondered, what's the value of something that's human-managed like agroecology or human co-inhabited like ecosystem in a city compared to these large-scale ecosystems? Can we probably only have 20% of the world a large-scale ecosystem if we manage 50% with like agroecology, or do we really have to, I don't know, spare 50%? Yeah, that's my question, the trade-off here.
Okay, thanks for that. So, okay, so the first one is on agroforestry, which I think is Rachel.
I can take a start, and if others want to join in. So we have a section on agroforestry. We did an assessment of agroforestry as one of the adaptation options in our chapter, and it came out as one of the strategies that can be both effective and feasible, and there's a rich literature on that. It, of course, depends on the context. It needs to be adapted to the local agroecosystem, the local socioeconomic context, but it does have a lot of potential for having multiple benefits, not only in terms of reducing climate risk, but also in terms of providing livelihoods, providing food security. So it has these multiple co-benefits. It can support biodiversity. It is, of course, very context dependent, but it is one of the options we highlight. And there's a nice section if you go to our chapter on agroforestry. I can take a crack at the agroecology question, and Mike, I don't know if you want to weigh in as well. So you're wondering, can you do both? Can you have agroecology and have this 30 to 50% protection of natural areas? So that's a big question. I don't know if you can answer that on a global scale with the literature that we have at the moment. There aren't many studies that take an agroecological approach and try to model it even at a regional scale, let alone there really aren't studies at a global scale asking that question. And one of the challenges is drawing on enough empirical literature. While it's a growing area, it still only receives about 2% of scientific research funding, and so there aren't enough studies across the globe to answer that, I think. But there is some regional studies that have been done. So in Europe, there was a study that looked at what would it take to transition Europe to an agroecological system, and they sort of set a 10-year target, because that's not something you can do overnight. And they estimated that while it would reduce yields somewhat, and of course varying by crop and by system, it was feasible to meet the food security needs, to meet the trade needs, and significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions with substantial shifts in diet and with addressing food waste. So it's a big transition. It's not something you do just on the farm, but it's something that you do for the whole food system, but with many co-benefits. Whether you can imagine that at a global scale, that's a bigger question. Whether that has, I believe it also strengthened biodiversity in that modeling study, but I think that's as far as I can go with that answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question, and obviously in a short series of talks, you have to boil it down to some quite simplistic sort of principles. Read the full 4,000 pages of the report, and there's much more nuance in there. But it's important to get the headline messages across, because that's the sort of level that a COP deals with. But that said, it's so important that actually you do the right thing in the right place. It's come up with the trees, but it's bigger than that. And which is the appropriate strategy, if you like, sort of, it's sometimes called land sparing or land sharing, isn't it? Which, on the one hand, have wilderness managing itself under largely natural processes. On the other hand, we really integrate production and ecology. And I think which is right, and I think there is space for both models, to be honest. I don't think it's either or, depends on local circumstances. So, in a lot of Europe, you've got land that has been managed more or less sustainably for hundreds of years until the last 100 years, when its intensifications let rip and species have been lost. And I think there is something there about going back to well, not going back, but trying to learn the lessons of how you can sustainably manage for food and other benefits, including, of course, biodiversity. But equally, I think, some of the great wildernesses of the world, which may include people living, as part of it, then I think that's different. And there's a lot of studies that have come up the last few years from Amazonia, particularly, showing how, as you sort of chip away at it, you lose something of the large-scale processes, the effects on local climate and rainfall, the stability of the whole system as to whether it flips to a different state. So, you can't really parcel up that into a series of little rainforests, if you like. So, I think it's getting the right solution in the right place. That's the answer there. But bearing in mind that bigger global context, that we do want to preserve a large area of land, which frankly in many cases wouldn't yield that much crop anyway, in a natural state. But in other places, maybe the emphasis more on production. In others, it may be more of an integrated approach, accepting a lower yield. But right action, right place.
Thanks. We've got time for another round, but just for my understanding. So we talked a lot about agroecology, agroforestry, and so this is all terrestrial-based issues, and then the 30 to 50%, I guess, is freshwater, terrestrial, and marine. So I don't know if Sarah, is there something you could sort of say about how do the oceans play in with this?
Yeah, I think the literature on ocean-based adaptation is less well developed than the literature on terrestrial adaptation and related to human systems, food systems. We've got centuries of observations and people trying things to adapt to new conditions. We don't have that in the oceans as much, so it's a little bit more of a challenge to really assess the evidence about how it's going on ocean-based adaptation and what do we need in the future. There are model projections that estimate that between 30 and 50% of oceans need to be sustained to maintain the flow of ecosystem services that sustain us. But there aren't that many models yet, so we don't have a large body of evidence to draw a robust conclusion about how much percent are we talking of the oceans, and how would we do that? Where would we do that? One of the challenges in every case is how do we select the right cross-section of ecosystem types, biomes, human systems, and places and pressures and places that are experiencing different sorts of climate and human system drivers. And that challenge is even greater in the oceans in some ways because we don't have that big body of observational evidence to help clue us in about what places need the most preservation the fastest and which ones will fare the best in the future. So that's very much a work in progress, Steve.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Are there any more questions? Would you like to have a second one?
I think I will take from the chapter on ocean and coastal area. And then I was asking myself, during the war, do you find a lot of publication really presenting the role of mangrove on adaptation in Africa? I really want to focus on Africa because it seems as if there is a lot of work mainly in Asia, but in Africa, I don't know if you really found some evidence that mangrove in Africa are really providing, I would say, adaptation. And then the other issue is also the protected area in ocean in Africa. Do we really have some important information on that? And then before closing on mangrove, I wanted to ask Christopher if they found some example of maladaptation on mangrove area, because you insisted on the, I would say, on the grassy ecosystem and so on. And then I wanted to know if during the war you found also some example of what could be maladaptation, I would say, in mangrove ecosystem.
Okay, so I'll ask one more. Oh, there's one more up the back.
Hi. You mentioned kind of the piece around like needing to have a certain amount of scale when you're doing these conservation efforts. You don't get the same benefits unless you're, preserving a certain area. But I'm wondering if you touched on it all, like how does that connect to the question of like ensuring that you're protecting the rights of communities and giving their consent around the conservation that's happening, and how you kind of square those two things?
Shall I take a crack at both of those?
Thanks, sir.
Okay, so for the questions, thank you for both of those questions. For the question about the African literature, I did not write the mangrove section, but it is my understanding that the literature is less abundant for Africa. I would love to be wrong, and I'm sure Chris can probably give me some more continent-specific information, but our numbers that we used on mangroves generally pulled from global aggregates, and I know that what you cited is true. There's a lot of information on mangroves in Southeast Asia, in Central America, but I think it is limited in the African area. So that's definitely a potential area to grow. And then the second question about preserving the rights of communities as you set up conservation measures. One of the things that came through very strongly in our analysis, in our assessment, was that adaptation that is undertaken in a portfolio approach tends to be more durable in the first place and successful to actually achieve the goals that it's set out to do. But one of the pieces of process that's critical is including local communities as you develop the adaptation portfolio. There's no one-size-fits-all adaptation, and including local communities includes not only their voices about what they want for the future, but also can include local knowledge and indigenous knowledge that predates the Western scientific record by a long shot. So inclusive processes where goals are co-developed from local communities as well as higher level governance authorities, national government, international goals. Those tend to provide the most robust outcomes. And the challenge is a lot of ocean-based adaptation has not been pursued for the goal of climate preparation. A lot of times it's biodiversity goals, or restoring habitat, or restoring coastal protection for coastal communities. It's not been done, hey, we want to be in this spot by 2030 or by 2050. And so in some ways, our following of how well that is going and how well communities are being included is really at its infancy. So, great question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So we're out of time, unless anyone really wants to jump in. But thank you all very much for coming to this session, and thanks to our 5 great speakers here tonight. I think it's been really good. I've certainly learned a lot. A few of you made the point that I always sort of talk about because I come from more of a mitigation background, but the idea that you need to limit to 1.5 for a lot of this adaptation to work, and that I think is a really important point. So Thanks for all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your Saturday evening, and enjoy your day off tomorrow, and maybe see you on Monday back here.